So, Ailey.
Eiley.
I said it wrong again. Eiley, have you ever been in a situation where you're talking to students, articulating your organization, particularly in the sustainability challenges, and receiving feedback?
No, not that specific. I've spoken to other university classes before, but usually it's just sharing the model. And so in this case, we were sort of like pulling the model apart and looking at areas of weakness in the model, areas to improve in the model. So that was really interesting for me.
So I would imagine that's very helpful for the organization.
Definitely, definitely. Because we're at a place, too, where we're thinking through some of this as we go into our next strategic planning. So it's kind of prompting us to work on some of those areas, too.
When you say this, what do you mean? Would you mind articulating the this?
So in our last strategic planning process, we developed this 7-year model of partnerships. And so as we come into, we're actually toward the end of this strategic plan now. So as we come into, sort of investigating how did we do on the strategic plan, where do we want to go forward, we actually need to start looking at the 7-year model and saying, okay, where is it working, where is it not working, are we recommending to stick with it, are we recommending some adaptations? So it's really sort of going deep. We're going to have to be doing that over the next year, so it's kind of a start to doing that.
And what a great way to have the input from Miss and these students.
Definitely, definitely.
They seem really bright.
I think so, yeah.
They ask really good questions.
They do, yeah. I think we just took the questions, so we'll bring those home with us.
For everybody. How would you say, you've spoken up at UCSC about the model. Mm-hmm. What makes the Firelight Foundation model different from normal or the usual nonprofit aiding, maybe even specifically to Africa, kind of?
Mm-hmm. I think one thing that's different about Firelight is that we are not a directive funder. So what that means for us is trusting small organizations as the authority of what the needs and assets are in their area. So whereas one organization working with children, they might see the need to prioritize child rights. Another organization working with children somewhere else, they might see the need for income generating activities. So it isn't Firelight sitting in Santa Cruz saying, we know the right prescription for the problems in your community. It's really entrusting that communities are the experts there. I think another thing that distinguishes us is that we work in partnership with organizations in the long term. So it's starting with small emerging organizations who are often off the radar for big donors. And over that period of 7 years, working with that organization in partnership and helping strengthen them for eventual conclusion of Firelight funding.
Have you found any other similar nonprofits working in this? I think it's a very postmodern, in a way, perspective. We're not the white people coming in to save the day, mm-hmm. but you are the people. We want to empower you and mm-hmm. help you in any way we can. Mm-hmm. Have you seen any other? Do you see that trend at all happening?
I think there's some other organizations who do this well. I still think it's rare, which is a shame. There's still so many organizations that are developing their program and their system in isolation from a community, and sort of, in some ways, their grant is hiring the organization to implement the funder's plan. And I'm surprised we haven't learned that lesson yet, sort of as a development industry.
Yeah, and this has been Firelight's thrust since the beginning.
Yeah, funding the small community-based organizations in Africa supporting children. That's been our thrust. It's adapted over time. In the beginning we didn't have a limitation of 7 years on the partnership. So as these organizations grew and grew, and our resources were going there now to these larger organizations, we had to realize there has to be a cutoff point at which we, sort of end that partnership and constantly rededicate those resources to small emerging organizations. So our method of working with our partners has adapted and evolved as we've learned, but it's still really focused on those small emerging community-based organizations.
I was really struck by the complexity of this beautiful idea, but putting it into practice mm-hmm. creates this type of complex situation. I'm assuming that this is an evolution and that the problem has emerged from the methodology, or maybe the challenges of sustainability have come from that. How have you, I mean, I can't imagine you just came in on this really complex situation and say, okay, how do we fix this? How do we make the challenges less overwhelming or unable to overcome? So I'm assuming you've been with Firelight for 6 years now. You've kind of grown with this and maybe had to get the complexity as it was evolving. I was just amazed about how difficult it looks.
Yeah, I mean, remember that I was presenting kind of the worst case scenario. So hopefully not every organization is facing every single one of those challenges. I think that if before I came to Firelight, someone said to me, what are the sustainability challenges facing a CBO? I think I would have thought much more about external factors. But just being at Firelight for this time, I look more at our role and how what we're doing does influence our partners. So, if we are just funding school fees year after year perpetually for 7 years, what happens in the 8th year, And so really thinking about how do we help bolster our partners to make their plans for sustainability and lay those plans as early as possible. So yeah, for me it's evolved, and I think I've gotten better at supporting our partners the more I've seen the challenges they face as they reach the conclusion of funding.
Well, I love the idea of beginning with the exit strategy at the beginning of the relationship. How far back did that kind of be introduced into the system?
That's really new for us. So the 7-year model started in 2009. That was when we did the strategic planning and established the 7-year parameters around the model. So we haven't taken any new partners. Our last new partners came in 2008. So actually this year, right now, actually tomorrow, is the deadline for new letters of inquiry from partners. So we'll probably take about 10 new partners this year. And it's really the first chance to say, okay, starting at ground zero, how do we structure this partnership? So we're really excited to see what happens there. Now, the partners that came in 2008, they found out the next year about the 7-year model and what their exit year would be. So I think the relationship is very different with those partners because they've known practically from the beginning that they need to prepare for the conclusion of funding.
I guess that would be it. I mean, if you'd want to just talk a little bit more about what your exit strategy looks like in the practical world, like obviously you're helping them figure out what they can do beyond the 7 years and sustain their organization, possibly build the organization, be able to help more. What are some of the things that you see in your exit strategy?
It really depends on the partner. So there's some partners that are on this trajectory.
I'm sorry, would you mind saying your exit strategies?
Exit strategies?
Yeah, if you could put that into your statement.
In the response. Okay, so in terms of exit strategy, it really depends on the partner. There's some partners who start small, access our funding, access other greater sources of funding. They're on a track to be able to access donor funding. And they've figured out how to write reports and proposals, satisfy donor requirements. So for those groups, it's like helping bolster their proposal writing and report writing and monitoring and evaluation. For smaller groups, we've started to realize some of them are probably never going to access any more external funding. And so we need to start thinking about how do they build sustainability within their own community. So how are they connecting with local government, for example, to access services from local government? Are they setting up some kind of an income-generating activity that will then bring resources back into the organization? How have they structured their relationships with their volunteers if they're providing stipends so that there's some kind of mechanism that allows those stipends to continue, whether it's pooled resources or savings and loan program between the volunteers or something like that. So we're really kind of finding each group is on its own trajectory, and how do we figure that out early on and sort of help them strategize.
I hear them coming. I want to ask one more question. Okay. One of the things that I also was struck by, the idea that sometimes the generating activities take away from the actual mission of the CBO, and so I would assume that this exit strategy would also kind of help them plan, because you were saying how important it is to plan that generating activity so that by the time the 7th year is done, they have it up full run, but they haven't put in all their resources, but it's been a gradual kind of thing.
Right.
How did you come up with that idea? It's a great idea.
I guess it's like from seeing a lot of organizations struggle with this, you know.
What is it that they're struggling?
So, for example, if an organization wants to get into a business, like let's say a maize mill, like I tried to draw a maize mill on that picture. Maize is corn, you know, so it's a grinding mill. That's the staple food. People bring they need there needs to be in a community a mechanism to grind maize. So it's like a pretty good, sustainable income generating activity. But there's been so many challenges when partners try to implement them. For example, who owns the land where the maize mill sits? Is the maize mill diesel operated or electricity operated? If it's diesel, you know, like what's their plan for getting diesel if it's in a remote location? If it's electrical, you know, how likely are they to get an electrical hookup, you know? Then what's the management plan for that maize mill? You know, in terms of like who will staff it, how will they be paid, how are profits used, how is money saved to help repair the maize mill if it falters, and then those profits that can be dedicated to the organization or its programs, how are those allocated? So organizations who embark on a plan like this without thinking through all those parts, they're often going to hit some obstacles on the way. And I just know this from seeing organizations do that over time. There's been maize mills we've funded that haven't been operational for almost 3 years because they've hit those roadblocks after roadblock after roadblock. And that's meant to have been there generating funds for their programs for 3 years, you know. So when organizations are proposing income generating activities, I ask them a lot of questions about it, and really sometimes you know, I'll recommend to the board that we award the grant minus the income generating activity amount until we see a better plan, and then award that as a separate grant. So really trying to help an organization be planful and walk through all the different steps. Because like I said, these people, they've been drawn to the organization because of their heart for children, their heart for service, because they see a problem in their community. They didn't come because they're like great accountants and financial managers and business entrepreneurs. So it's like, I'm not an entrepreneur either. So together we have to kind of figure out, you know, what are the best steps. Yeah. That's okay.
That was great.
Okay.
I think there was one other question I was going to ask you about Firelight doesn't, you don't fund for specific projects. You actually fund the community-based organization because of their proposal to you. So you don't really have this, like, you know, the usual nonprofit, we want to see this out of you, and then if you don't give that, then we're not going to refund you. When there was a question about that fine line between you want to help them, maybe some experience from your past you can see that, oh, they have a maize and it's a diesel and you know, or electricity, and you can see already the challenges for them. But you don't. Firelight doesn't really put upon that organization Firelight's, how do I say it, kind of agenda in a way. So it must be very difficult. That's where you decide who to fund. Like that's at the beginning of the relationship is when.
Well, each year an organization is putting together like a proposed budget and narrative explaining, you know, what they want to do with the funds. And you're right, we're not a directive funder. So we're not saying you shouldn't be doing education, you should be working on health, you know, like that's not our agenda at all. But if an organization was to propose something that didn't seem like, you know, there was a strong rationale for it, if, you know, we want to always say to them, help us understand why it's important for you to be doing this in your community. Or if there's something that we're not getting in terms of their program design, you know, we'll ask them questions about it. And there are times we decide not to fund something. But most times it's usually we just don't have enough background information on the context or their plans. So sometimes the questions that we ask them are prompting them to think through their plans a little more, but oftentimes they just haven't written it all down for us yet. So there is a question back and forth process that we do from here in Santa Cruz. But then also we have resource people in country. So if there's questions that are kind of intractable that we're not getting clarity on from doing the back and forth thing, then our partners there can go and visit them and, you know, really